Well, today marks the first Sunday in Advent. Advent, which we might understand as that in-between season. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, has come, our tradition says. Yet our tradition also says that Christ, once come, is to come again. And so we wait with anticipation. Anticipation in the narrative we know, where we are waiting the birth of Christ again, God come in human form back then. Anticipation in the narrative we tell of the restoring Christ who will come again. The opening words from Isaiah today are words of anticipation in the days to come. These are the words of one who is named a prophet. When you know these are words named by a prophet, does that cause you to hear them as predicting and speaking of things that are yet to come? It's interesting, though, because these words that we think might be of the future told by a prophet are centuries old. Isaiah, son of Amos, lived in a particular context, for it says this word is concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the time that Isaiah lived. And the poetry we heard today is redolent with words of hope of a restored creation. But when we look back over the history of time, this hasn't come to pass. It hasn't come to pass. So we look back in linear time to hear tell of things still to take place in the future, this in-between time. The gospel words we heard today, I might understand as being part of a hinge time. They come from the mouth of Jesus, the one that we have named since then, God with us. That hinge time when God was present here on earth, speaking of things still to come, of future hope. But about that day and that hour, no one knows, only the Father. All we know is it is to come. And while we wait, we are to keep awake, waiting with what we know of what has been, and from what we know, what we expect is to come. In these 4 Sundays of Advent, we have decided to pay attention to the readings of Isaiah, to return them to their own context and to hear what they have to speak to us without necessarily appropriating them entirely to our Christian narrative. Curiously, as I have explored a bit of Isaiah and these texts before us, the potency within the context of its time and place is renewed, and interestingly, potency continues from them to us now. But all of you know a lot about the book of Isaiah, I'm assuming, is that right? No, I wouldn't say that of myself either, so I confess that I have borrowed some words and some ideas from a chap called Gordon McConville, who knows a lot more about these things than me, so taken some advice from him. As we hear from today's the opening of today's passage, the book of Isaiah is attributed to Isaiah, son of Amos. According to the introduction to the book, Isaiah worked in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, but mainly in Ahaz and Hezekiah. That's when Isaiah's main activity took place. So we're talking about 735 to 687 BCE. The relationship between Isaiah and Ahaz, who was the first one that's formed, we hear a little bit later, and it happens when Ahaz is at a crisis point. Not only is he under threat of the Assyrian growing power in the area, but the nation of Judah has recently been attacked by an alliance between Israel and Syria. This was when, of course, Judah and Israel were separated one from the other. And Ahaz's choice for self-defense is to turn to Assyria, which seems to be going quite well. But one of the other things that he does in making this decision is to introduce some Assyrian temple worship practices into the Jerusalem temple, and this is where Isaiah and Ahaz do not agree on things. And so at this time, Isaiah begins one of his major themes, that the king and people should not trust an alliance with a foreign power for survival and prosperity. They should trust in God. This theme continues through Isaiah's work with Hezekiah, who is Ahaz's son. And this threat of Assyria forms the background of Isaiah's ministry. This threat from the superpower is a setting for which Isaiah calls for faithfulness. But when you consider the whole corpus, the whole work of Isaiah, the book, the concern for faithfulness when threatened by a dominating power is not limited to Assyria. Babylon appears as a much more dominant focus later on, and in historical times, Babylon succeeded Assyria as the leading power in about 605 BC. And then, as we know, Judah fell and went into Babylonian exile, and that was about 587 BCE. And by this time, Isaiah had been dead for about a century. But we know that Isaiah, the chapters 40 to 55, concern the people of Judah in exile, and the beginning of Isaiah 56 and Isaiah 65 to 66 address a community that has returned from exile to Jerusalem. So these historical events that inform the backdrop of this whole corpus of Isaiah suggest it simply can't have been written by one person. However, much modern scholarship has come to think that the book of Isaiah has been deliberately shaped as a whole in its present form over a very long period of time. And so they interpret Isaiah as having a unity and coherence in its themes and its theology. Of course, there is no way to work out the message of Isaiah, and who would want to reduce it to that? But once we assume that Isaiah didn't write the whole of it, not all of it are his words, then there are some common themes, there are some common thoughts. Scholars have these things, there's some common ideas about what Isaiah is saying. And as I want to introduce a few of those, Gordon McConville has made suggestions about some common themes, and I want to invite you to consider how these themes impact our own understanding of faith and how to live it out. These scholars assert that Isaiah's message is based on a single foundation, and that single foundation is the belief that Yahweh, God of Israel, is the only one who is high and lifted up, that no other earthly power can challenge Yahweh, nor any other God. McConville argues that this shapes Isaiah's thinking in his politics and ethics and the future of Judah and Jerusalem. As we've already heard, politically, there's a consistent argument that in crisis, rulers should trust in Yahweh, because Yahweh has power over all of history, authority over kings of Judah and of all nations, and authority over the forces of nature. When thinking about ethics and the future of Jerusalem and Judah, the claim is made that in Isaiah, God's overriding aim is to establish righteousness and justice. And this is the imagery we heard of Jerusalem that dominates the poetry of Isaiah. The assertion is that this idea of righteousness and justice comes from the nature of God, is a characteristic of God. God who is holy desires a certain kind of order because that is what God is like. I thought this particularly interesting, the idea that God's power to save the people is for the purpose of making them a people who show justice and righteousness. Isaiah's message is a vision, an unfolding a view of what society could and should be like. It declares God's intention to make God's chosen people into such a society, even if they consistently fail. One of the things I was interested to learn, although it is not mentioned in the book of Isaiah, that it doesn't record the fall of Jerusalem that happened in 587 BCE. But this question of God's plan for Jerusalem is worked out in the light of the fact that Jerusalem gets destroyed. So this hope has happened after it would seem all hope is lost. So put this into our time, these ideas of a twin vision, of this idea of what could be and what isn't yet. In our time, do we not hold a vision of being God's people, people of righteousness and of justice, where plowshares dominate over guns? Do we not think that it is our call to incarnate this righteousness and justice, this nature of God, which might seem a big claim, But this is the revelation of Jesus, is it not? Of how humans can live and be. And we know we fall short, yet the vision of hope that this can be made real remains with us. So Isaiah's twin vision still challenges us. We still look back for such words of future hope. They join those gospel words of our Christian tradition that we say stands in continuity to that one of Isaiah. And it's still speaking of future hope. Yet we live now, in this time, when things are not aligned according to what we imagine divine vision is. Has this come to impact what we expect of God in real life? We look back, we can trace the arc of our scripture, and we can see how God has been in the life of the faithful and in the world. And we look forward as we hear promise of God's restoration of the world that is to come. We look around our world today and find it hard to imagine God is with us. Surely this world is too broken and hurtful and too messy and complicated to coexist with God. We humans are too overrun with our own importance, bent on the destruction of our creation for it to be true that divine presence is with us. Do we find it hard to imagine some divine presence as active, as real and tangible and provably able to make any difference? You see, easily, this idea of divine activity in the world becomes an optional extra, a nice accessory, but not a fundamental requirement for and of life. But is this because we have come to fit God to our expectations of what right living and of justice and of righteousness will look like? And because we don't see the things the way we imagine they would be if God was with us here, then we interpret this to mean that God is largely absent. Because surely when everything is made good and beautiful and bountiful and full of life, then it proves that God is here. But what if God is here? And it is we who fail to recognize such presence because it isn't what we think it should be. I was struck by a poem that Malcolm Guite wrote. He's an Anglican priest in England and a poet. He wrote it for last week's feast day, Christ the King, and I apologize in advance for the male language. It is taking the image of the man of sorrows from Isaiah. Our King is calling from the hungry furrows, whilst we are cruising through the isles of plenty. Our hoardings screen us from the man of sorrows. Our sand tracks drown his murmur, I am thirsty. He stands in line to sign in as a stranger and seek a welcome from the world he made. We see him only as a threat, a danger. He asks for clothes, and we strip-search him instead. And if he should fall sick, then we take care that he does not infect our private health. We lock him in the prisons of our fear, lest he unlock the prison of our wealth. But still, on Sunday, we shall stand and sing the praises of our hidden Lord and King. In our in-between time, have we come to hold lightly to the possibility of God in real time? Maybe in this meantime, we wait and hope for God to make our world right. I've begun to wonder where this vision of things hoped for, or future hope of divine restoration, has come to lull us to think, no matter how badly we act or what the things we do wrong, ultimately, we can't destroy things because, God's in charge. It's sort of like a get-out-of-jail-free card. So quietly, we absent our responsibility to grow into the stature of divine creation of us. And like children, we expect someone else to provide for us, someone else to clean up after us, someone else to make things all better. If we were to dig deep enough and inquire close enough, might this be a little bit of what we think? Maybe we're just a little bit parent God hung up? You see, it affects how we understand who we are. It affects how we understand our place in creation, our role, our responsibility in life, and our responsibility for the life of this world. It affects what we expect to find in life now.